Put your hands behind your back. Now, old man.
The
Police officer's voice cut coldly through the courtroom. No questions. No negotiation. No hesitation. The man standing before them said nothing. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He simply turned around slowly and placed his wrists behind his back. Metal clicked shut. The handcuffs tightened around wrists already trembling with age. Whispers rose inside the courtroom. Someone chuckled softly. Someone else shook their head. A look of open contempt swept across the gallery. Another bitter old veteran. Dangerous. Just look at his eyes. On the case file, his name was read quickly, like an unimportant detail: Thomas Hale. 66 years old. Former United States Marine. To them, he was just a silent old man. And in this room, silence was treated as a sign of guilt. No one asked why he didn't defend himself. No one wondered why he didn't speak up. And no one knew that this very silence had once saved countless lives. As the chains locked around his wrists, no one in that courtroom realized they had just handcuffed a man who once ended violence through restraint alone. If you believe that true courage isn't found in gunfire, but in the silence of those who have walked through war, subscribe to Service Honor Stories so we can preserve the memory, dignity, and respect owed to our heroes. Thomas Hale sat alone at the defendant's table. His back was straight. His hands rested calmly on the scarred wooden surface. His eyes were so composed they unsettled anyone who met them. No pleading, no resistance, no searching for sympathy from anyone in that room. The chair beside him was empty. No trusted attorney, no family, not a single old friend standing up to say they knew who he was. His name was printed on the file like a cold line of text. Thomas Hale, 66 years old, former United States Marine. Beyond those words, there was nothing else to say about him, at least not in the way this court chose to see him. From the gallery, whispers drifted out, quiet enough to avoid reprimand, yet sharp enough to cut through the air. Just PTSD. Those kinds of veterans are always like that. He never adjusted to civilian life. No one spoke directly to him. They spoke to each other. They spoke to reassure themselves that they already understood this story, that the silence was merely a sign of instability, that the calm was just a mask for bottled-up anger. Thomas Hale didn't turn around. He heard everything, and he corrected nothing. A nearby officer shifted his weight slightly, as if the stillness itself made him uneasy. There was no defiant stare, no provocation, just an old man sitting quietly, too quietly, in a way that tested other people's patience. The judge looked down at the file, then back at him. Her gaze lingered longer than necessary. She waited for a reaction, a sigh, an explanation. Some sign that he understood he was being judged. But Thomas Hale gave them nothing. He wasn't afraid of being convicted. That fear had left him a long time ago. What showed on his face wasn't anxiety, it was weariness. Weariness from being seen wrong. Weariness from standing before people who believed they could understand a man completely after only a few minutes of watching him. He had faced far worse situations than this. He had heard sounds far more violent than those whispers, but never had he felt so invisible standing in a room full of people yet not truly seen by a single one of them. Thomas Hale lowered his eyes for a brief moment. Not to avoid anything, just an old habit, as if reminding himself to stay calm, to keep discipline, to keep silent. Silence to him was not escape. It was how he survived. A clerk tapped lightly on the desk, breaking the oppressive quiet. Papers were rearranged. A familiar procedure resumed. The trial did not pause for his stillness. If anything, it moved past him faster, as though his silence made everyone feel there was no reason to wait. No one asked why he wouldn't speak. No one wondered whether he had grown accustomed to never being asked. Thomas Hale remained there, composed like a shadow that failed to reflect its true shape. He did not seek pity. He only hoped that his silence would stop being used as evidence against him. But in this room, silence was not treated as dignity. It was treated as an empty space for others to fill with their prejudice. And that very silence, the thing that had once kept him alive, had now become the reason people rushed to conclude that he deserved to be condemned. The first witness stepped forward. His voice was firm, his eyes avoiding contact. He said that Thomas Hale had moved too close, that his gaze was threatening, that the atmosphere had felt extremely dangerous. Each sentence landed like a pebble thrown into still water, small ripples just enough to convince listeners that something was about to break. Thomas Hale did not react. He remained seated. His shoulders did not move. The alleged victim stepped up next. Young, careful in a way that felt rehearsed. He told his story with details added deliberately, as if fear itself had to be constructed to fit the role. His voice trembled where it was meant to tremble. He paused where a pause was needed. "I thought I was going to die," he said. "I was truly afraid." Someone in the room nodded. Someone else held their breath. Fear, when told the right way, always finds those willing to believe it. Then came the pivotal line, dropped like a cold blade. He said he could take me out from 800 yards. A low murmur spread through the courtroom. A few eyes turned toward Thomas Hale, not to understand, but to confirm the prejudice that had just been planted. Thomas Hale did not look up. He did not deny it. He did not confirm it. His silence was taken as admission. The prosecutor rose. His tone was calm, his argument precise. He did not need to shout. He only needed to strike the right point. "A military past," he said, "is not a license to threaten others." Then he steered the narrative where he wanted it, a veteran carrying violent skills, unable to adapt to civilian life prone to eruption. "We are not judging heroism," he said. "We are judging a threat." The word threat hung in the air. It stuck to Thomas Hale like a label. More heads nodded now. Fewer eyes hesitated. An image of a veteran formed quickly, not from truth, but from collective fear. A man trained to kill, now seen as an unexploded device. Thomas Hale sat there listening as his past was turned into an indictment. Years of service reduced to a single danger. Discipline twisted into menace. And silence, the principle he had lived by, transformed into evidence. A soft laugh came from the back row. Someone whispered, "I knew it." No one asked what he had actually said. No one asked what he had not said. Thomas Hale clenched his hands slightly. Not in anger, out of habit. An old reflex of someone trained to keep his body still when everything around him turns chaotic. He understood what was happening. He knew this story no longer needed his voice. It was complete enough for those who wanted a conclusion. The prosecutor ended with a brief statement. "We cannot afford to underestimate this fear. Humiliation did not come from direct insults. It came from being defined incorrectly in front of everyone and from no one feeling the need to correct it." Thomas Hale looked up for the first time. His eyes swept across the room. Not in defiance, not in pleading. Just a look as if he were taking note of how easily people distort a man when they lack the patience to listen. He lowered his gaze again. Silence returned to its place. The trial went on. Time moved faster. Questions were asked only to reinforce a verdict already decided. In that room, Thomas Hale was no longer a whole human being. He was a cropped image, enough to fear, not enough to understand. The trial was nearly over. Until somewhere beyond these assumptions, someone remembered who Thomas Hale truly was and began to step into the story. The jury rose almost in unison. No exchanged glances, no hesitation. They withdrew to the deliberation room with the speed of a familiar procedure. Every movement was clean cold, precise as if the conclusion had already been shaped before the door closed. Thomas Hale remained where he was. He didn't watch them leave. He didn't breathe any heavier. Inside the courtroom, the silence changed its tone. It was no longer the silence of waiting, but the silence of, "It's almost over." The prosecutor gathered his papers. The judge flipped through the file, her pen tapping out a steady rhythm. For them, the trial was moving toward a reasonable ending. Outside, footsteps multiplied. News traveled quickly in a small town. Local media began to gather. No shouting, no pushing. Just microphones being set up, notebooks opening, eyes waiting for a story simple enough to retell. In the hallway, a few men stopped. Different ages, plain clothes, no invitations, no names on a list. They stood quietly, as if listening to the same pulse without needing to say it aloud. "Something isn't right," one of them said softly. The other nodded. No explanation needed. They had seen that look before. The look of someone accustomed to being misunderstood, yet still disciplined. The look of someone who didn't need to prove who he was. They hadn't come to testify. They had come because of this feeling, because if no one stood close, something important would slip by in silence. Thomas Hale didn't know they were there. He didn't need to. In the parking lot outside the courthouse, a black vehicle came to a stop. No siren. No noise. The door opened. A man stepped out. His posture straight. His stride steady. On his shoulders, 4 stars were clearly visible, not displayed, but unmistakable. A security officer noticed first. He straightened a fraction more. No one asked for credentials. No one blocked the way. The man gave a single nod, an old habit, and kept walking. Inside the courtroom, no one knew what was approaching. The jury hadn't returned. The judge was still reviewing the file. The prosecutor glanced at his watch. Thomas Hale lowered his eyes, hands resting calmly. The escalation was happening outside, quiet, certain, without announcement. A reporter recognized the insignia. A recorder clicked on. A question was swallowed. The four-star general did not slow. He hadn't come to answer the press. He had come for a name printed on the court's docket. The hallway seemed to narrow with his presence, not because of power, but because of focus. Those standing there felt something shifting, silent, but irreversible. The courtroom door remained closed. Inside, they waited for a brief conclusion. Outside, a truth was advancing slowly, but unstoppable. Two worlds, procedure and memory, were preparing to collide. Thomas Hale looked up for a moment, not because he heard his name, just a familiar feeling, like the wind changing direction before a storm. He didn't know what was coming, but he knew this sensation the moment when control begins to slip from those who believed the story was already finished. And when the courtroom door opened again, not to deliver a verdict, but to admit a truth, the balance of power began to shift quietly and beyond reversal. The door opened. A man wearing 4 stars on his shoulders walked straight into the courtroom. He didn't scan the room for a seat. He didn't look for the judge. He didn't look at the prosecutor. He went directly to the defense table, to where Thomas Hale was sitting. The room rose almost at once. No one gave the order. No one explained why. A reflex long forgotten awakened in their bodies. When real authority enters, it doesn't need an introduction. Thomas Hale lifted his head. His eyes met the eyes of the man standing before him. No surprise, no emotion. Just the look of two men recognizing each other after many years without the need for words. The general stopped in front of him. He stood at attention. His voice came out slow and clear, every word audible to everyone in the room. This man is the reason I'm alive. The sentence wasn't loud, but it fell into the courtroom like a heavy object. The prosecutor froze. The judge set her pen down. The whispers vanished completely. No one laughed. No one doubted. The atmosphere changed, not because of rank, but because the truth had just been placed on the table. The general turned slightly toward the room. He wasn't angry. He wasn't accusing anyone. He continued speaking as if correcting a mistake that had gone on far too long. Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Hale, Marine sniper. His identity was spoken in full, not trimmed, not explained further. A few people held their breath. A few lowered their heads. A few pairs of eyes began to look away. The accusations from moments earlier suddenly felt out of place. The image of a dangerous old man could no longer stand. In their minds, two versions collided: the man who had been handcuffed earlier and the man whose name was now spoken with absolute respect. Thomas Hale did not react. He didn't adjust his posture. He didn't search for agreement in anyone's eyes. He was used to his identity arriving late. The general continued, his voice slightly lower. He doesn't have a habit of talking about the past. He never asked to be remembered. But some things cannot be allowed to disappear. A soft cough came from the gallery. Someone clicked their tongue as if realizing they had been too quick to judge. Another person murmured, "We got this wrong." There was no need for argument, no need for defense. This recognition didn't lift Thomas Hale up. It pulled everyone else down to the level of humility required to truly look again. The judge straightened. Her gaze no longer probed. It listened. The prosecutor swallowed hard. The sharp arguments from earlier now had nowhere to land. None of them had been prepared for this moment, a moment where truth required no evidence, only the right voice to speak it. Thomas Hale looked down at his hands. He didn't smile. He didn't look relieved. He simply exhaled slowly, as if the weight had never been the threat of conviction, but the burden of letting others speak for him at last. The general looked back at him. He didn't bend down. He didn't place a hand on his shoulder. He simply stood there at the proper distance between two soldiers who understood each other. A very slight nod. Enough to say, "I remember." The crowd began to shift in a different way. No more curiosity. No more judgment. Only the discomfort of people realizing they had looked wrong, spoken wrong, and believed wrong too quickly. The name had been spoken correctly, but the truth had not yet been fully told. And only when the story from long ago was finally recounted without embellishment, detail by detail, did the truth truly descend, forcing everyone to listen. The general turned toward the jury. His voice dropped not to stir emotion, but as if he were rereading a report that had never been released. 31 years ago, he said we were pinned down on the edge of a ruined urban zone. Communications were cut. Maps were no longer accurate, and the perimeter was closing in. No one in the courtroom spoke. The short, clipped sentences fell one by one as though each word had been weighed for a long time before being spoken. We had wounded 2 men. They couldn't move. We couldn't call for extraction. The general paused for a moment. His eyes did not look at Thomas Hale. They stared into the empty space ahead of him, where old memories were opening. Then we heard gunfire. Not chaotic, not panicked. Separated shots, even, precise. He tilted his head slightly, as if he could still hear the sound. None of us saw the shooter. No one heard him say a single word. The general swallowed, but every time a shot rang out, a threat disappeared. 12 shots, in just a few short minutes. No excess, no waste. He raised one hand, holding it suspended in the air. Those shots opened a way out. Several people in the courtroom shifted in their seats. They were no longer leaning back, no longer breathing evenly. The truth being told did not sound like a heroic tale. It sounded like a cold, after-action report about survival. The final shot, the general continued, came from nearly 1,000 yards away. Someone inhaled softly. Someone else frowned, trying to picture it. Crosswind. Moving target. One chance. He turned his head and for the first time looked directly at Thomas Hale. And he didn't miss. Thomas Hale remained still. He didn't bow his head. He didn't react. The general slowed his voice. That shot saved my life, and it saved the lives of the men with me. No one interrupted. No one asked a question. The earlier testimonies about fear, about threats, now shrank, losing their weight and relevance. The general lowered his voice. This man could have killed many people, but he didn't. He paused, letting the sentence stand on its own. He knows restraint, the general said, because he understands what war truly is. Not romance, not medals, but the cost of every single shot. Thomas Hale lifted his eyes briefly. His gaze did not seek recognition. It touched the man who had survived because of him, then withdrew as if that were enough. The general turned back to the room. If you believe that a man like this would stand in civilian life and threaten someone with violence, he said, then you have never understood what self-control truly means. The accusations no longer had a place to stand. No rebuttal was needed. No further proof required. The truth had been set down in the middle of the room, not loudly, not an argument. It existed by the weight of itself. And once that truth had been spoken, there was nothing left to justify, only one thing left to do: bow one's head and acknowledge it. The general took one more step forward. He stopped in front of Thomas Hale, close enough to face him, distant enough not to impose. The room held its breath. No one could guess what would happen next. Then he knelt. Not slowly for effect, not suddenly for shock. Just a decisive movement, like a choice weighed over many years. I'm sorry, the general said. His voice did not tremble. No excuses. No plea for personal forgiveness. I'm sorry, he repeated, for a system that forgot you. The words fell to the floor like a heavy object. They didn't echo, but they spread. Across every row, every face, every thought that had just been forced to change. The courtroom went silent. No whispers. No sighs. An apology from a man wearing 4 stars did not elevate Thomas Hale. It pulled everyone else down to the level of humility required to look directly at their own mistake. Thomas Hale looked down, not in haste, not in avoidance. He looked at the man kneeling before him, a man who had once survived because of him, a man now standing on the side of truth, not power. He stood up, not to be honored, not to claim credit. Thomas Hale reached out and helped the general to his feet. The motion was clean, familiar, like pulling a fellow soldier out of danger. No comforting words, no ceremony. Enough, he said. Then very softly he added, let it go. Just 4 words, no explanation, no judgment. The room needed nothing more. Forgiveness was not spoken to erase what had happened. It was spoken to end the burden of carrying it forward. Thomas Hale carried no resentment. He carried no need to be vindicated. He carried only one principle that had followed him throughout his military life. Honor does not require defense. The general stood upright again. He said nothing more. He nodded a nod from someone who understood that some apologies are not meant for the past, but to correct how we move forward. The judge placed a hand on the bench. She did not speak right away. Her eyes moved across the room, across faces that had just learned a lesson no one wrote down. The prosecutor lowered his head, not in defeat, but in recognition of something more important than winning a case. Thomas Hale sat back down. His back remained straight. His expression remained calm. But the loneliness of earlier moments was gone, not because he had been recognized, but because the truth now stood where it belonged. The lesson was not that one man was cleared. It was that an entire room had changed the way it saw. Honor does not need words to protect it. It stands on its own when pride steps aside. And when pride steps aside, justice finally has room to stand quietly but unshakably. The judge straightened. She looked down at the file in front of her, then up at Thomas Hale. Her voice rang out clearly without hesitation. The court hereby dismisses all charges. There was no cheering, no applause. Only a silence that was heavy but clean. The chains were removed. No one touched him carelessly anymore. No rushed commands. No unnecessary movements. Every gesture slowed as if the room had just learned how to show respect at the right moment. Thomas Hale stood up. He didn't exhale in relief. He didn't smile. He simply stood there, back straight, the way he had stood his entire life. Outside in the hallway, men were waiting. No one had planned it. No one gave a signal. When Thomas Hale stepped out, they stood at attention. No shouted command, no uniforms, just instinct shared by those who recognize one another through discipline and silence. One man raised his hand in salute. The next followed. Then all of them. Thomas Hale paused for a brief moment. He nodded slightly. He did not return the salute. He didn't need to. Respect here did not require symmetry. He kept walking. Reporters called his name. Questions were thrown out, hurried the way the world always demands explanations. Thomas Hale did not turn back. He owed no one an answer. He had already spoken enough through silence used at the right time. The general walked behind him half a step slower. Not escorting, not leading, just bearing witness as he had chosen to do from the beginning. No more words were exchanged. Everything that needed to be said had already been said. Thomas Hale exited the courthouse. He remained silent. He did not need to be vindicated. The world needed to remember correctly. To remember that there are people who have done the impossible, then return to live as if they had done nothing remarkable. To remember that true courage does not seek attention, does not need to be named. It exists quietly and accepts being misunderstood until someone has the patience to look again. Thomas Hale disappeared from view. No calls after him. No exclamation marks. All that remained was a room that had changed. A system reminded that honor is not something to be put on trial. It is something to be protected even when the one who carries it does not speak. Some lessons do not come from verdicts. They come from the silence after the verdict. And if anything was left behind today, it was not the story of a man who was cleared. It was the memory of a man who chose silence when he could have spoken restraint, when he could have harmed, and forgiveness when he could have demanded more. Thomas Hale did not become a symbol. He did not need to. His legacy lies elsewhere in how we relearn when to bow our heads and how to remember the right people. Service honor stories, we remember the quiet heroes. If this story makes you believe that honor and kindness never retire, please like this video, share it, and subscribe to Service Honor Stories so that none of their memories are ever forgotten.